J.D. Vance will be in Armenia and Azerbaijan in the coming weeks. And according to Trump, to build on the August 8 agreements that were brokered by Washington. Now, this shows, I think, the administration's commitment to TRIPP, and not only TRIPP, there were multiple documents that were signed, and the peace process itself. But what should we not overstate or misinterpret about it? I mean, how significant is America's participation?
Listen, this is a very good question, right? There's so much sort of misinformation
Sure.
spread throughout the diaspora by certain so-called lobbying organizations. There's a lot of misinformation spread out in Armenia by basically opposition parties, even well-intentioned people that have no idea what's going on. And it leads to a lot of confusion. And of course, our government's lack of proper strategic communication capabilities also takes something that's extraordinarily fascinating like TRIP and basically puts a lot of question marks on it. We know that that's the problem, right? You have something good, but you're not doing a good job of basically communicating. So, just to make a few points clear, okay, TRIP fundamentally, okay, is designed to make the South Caucasus, specifically Armenia, specifically our southern corridor, as part of the Trans-Caucasus or the Trans-Caspian route. That means Armenia is being integrated into broader regional projects. Okay, that's the first point. Since 1994, we have been excluded from every regional project. Okay, and this full pride of basically we boycott this and we boycott that. Where's the benefit in that, right? Right? It's being, oh, I'm enjoying my marginalization. That is not a foreign policy. That is not a strategy, right? So what TRIP does is it integrates Armenia into this broad continental and subcontinental project. Okay, that's the first one. So strategically, it's fundamentally important for Armenia. All right. Two, we got to stop politicizing this. Okay, you're not going to have hidden Turkish companies. You're not going to have hidden, I don't know, Azerbaijani companies, indies. Armenia's sovereignty is not being abdicated. There's stuff that's written in black and white. Okay, right? There's an agreement. It's on paper. Okay. Some choose to completely ignore those writings and engage in speculation and conspiracy theories. What are we going to do? Start chasing conspiracy theories and debunking every nonsense out there?
No, but I
No,
mean,
right?
but the look, these narratives are playing on people's fears, right? I mean,
Definitely,
so
definitely. That's how conspiracy theories and misinformation
sure.
work, right? They basically exploit fear,
But are
right?
there no
That's the
legitimate
issue.
concerns here? Are there no legitimate concerns?
Legitimate concerns regarding what? Okay. Legitimate concerns, for example, in the sense that, oh, you're about to get a couple of $1 billion in investments. Yeah, let's be worried about that. You like infrastructural development capacity. You have a country that's basically has third world infrastructure, messed up roads, and all this stuff. You're going to be able to develop those and strengthen those. Let's be concerned about that, right? You have a railway system that in 2007, Kocharyan sold it to the Russians for pennies, and you basically abdicated one of the most important strategic infrastructural and transit capacities. Okay, now you're trying to at least reclaim that. We won't be worried about that, right? So the issue here is that the thinking, right, the paradigm is wrong. You can't be basically have fallen so low that every positive development is a good thing for you, but you keep acting that you're at the level of a developed country. Okay. This is what most in the diaspora, or even the false critics, right, don't understand. Okay, so Armenia's entire infrastructure, right, from the Soviet period all the way to maybe a few years ago, was third world. Messed up roads, most villages didn't have access. I mean, we've been building a north south road for 30 years. It's laughable. In the West, that's like, what, a 1 year project? Okay. 30 years to build a single road. Okay. We got to be honest about these things. So you cannot come from that level of infrastructural failure. Okay. Right. Underdevelopment, and then criticize a project that is designed to pour billions into Armenia, okay, integrate Armenia into regional transiting systems, all right, and offer Armenia all of these objectives of interconnectivity. Now, to your point, okay, let's say hypothetically, some of the things that are anticipated in TRIP do not pan out the way you had anticipated, that everything doesn't work out perfectly. Not that usually these things do. So what? Look where you are and look where you're going. So this very arrogant, right, self-righteous perspective that if we don't get everything that we want, or if we don't get all the things that we anticipate we're going to get, therefore there are risks. It suggests a very fundamental misunderstanding of what risk constitutes. So my whole point is, I'm not saying TRIPP is the be all end all. It's not a silver bullet. There are no silver bullets in security or geopolitics. But what it does is it gives Armenians sort of this lot of strong sets of tools that allows us to go from a weak, defeated, underdeveloped country that we have been for the last 30 years, even though we like to lie to ourselves, toast to our heroes, bang our chests, sing songs that were developed in the 1920s about our haiduks and our fidais, which is great for cultural stuff. That's not state development. That's not security. Okay, right? That is not institutional development. Okay, so we are going right from a state of underdeveloped into being integrated in broader systems of commerce, of trade, of interconnectivity. Okay, that is the broad picture. If you understand it through that lens, now you see why TRIP becomes so important for Armenia.
Right, but you're
Okay,
looking
and
at
it's
it
not
from
a
an
question of
economic.
this country or that country.
Okay, no, I
Yeah, go ahead.
understand. You're looking at it, you're looking at the economic benefits, at the infrastructure, development
At the
benefits.
security benefits,
Okay, security, definitely. If there's foreign investment in the country, they're going to be more motivated to protect Armenia's security, through their own
I mean, you
government.
start
I
mattering. You
understand.
haven't mattered for 30 years. Everybody looked
I
at you as a Russian satellite. We got to be
Sure,
honest about that.
sure, I understand that. But if the TRIP road, okay, is only going to be a road connecting Azerbaijan to exclave Nakhichevan, and there's no reciprocity, then it becomes problematic. No.
Absolutely, absolutely. But who said there's not going to be
Well,
reciprocity?
what
Why,
guarantees?
why are those running around lying to the people there's going to be no reciprocity? Matter of fact, we're doing the same thing with Aliev, right? Every time I'm in DC, meeting with State Department, National Security Council, and all that stuff, I do the same thing, right? I'm like, hey guys, we're afraid of reciprocity, and the Americans are like, come on, can you guys tone it down? This is the guy who just allowed wheat to go through. He's trying to send fuel. He's trying to demonstrate to us that he wants reciprocity, but we're like, but we don't trust him.
But
But he's an evil
reciprocity
dictator. We
isn't
don't trust him.
reciprocity isn't only about bringing in wheat or oil or whatever.
No, giving
Reciprocity is
Armenia access to roads. Absolutely, right. And so right now, until TRIP is built, right? Okay, until TRIP is built, Azerbaijan has already a lot of its roads built. Until TRIP is built and you start having trade, right? Then you have reciprocity. That's one. Okay. Two, I've kind of publicly spoken about this on and off. The Europeans are coming in to build to support the Kars Gyumri railway. Okay, that means there's now broader investments in growing the interconnectivity of Armenia. Okay, now the Americans want the Ijevan transit route into Azerbaijan also built as part of the project, because everybody knows that if you're going to take a country and you're going to integrate them into the Trans-Caspian route or the Middle Corridor project, these intercontinental projects, you can't do it based on a single road that connects one country to its exclave. They have to be realistic about that. Okay, and it's not like the United States is going to invest billions and then hold a investor forum in London sometime later in the year to bring all this private investment money for a single road that connects Azerbaijan to Azerbaijan. This is not a serious conversation, right? And that's why I don't want to be sarcastic or condescending. That's not the objective here, even though it comes naturally sometimes.
I
But,
know.
but the point I want to make is that, when you're having, right, multiplicity of countries, serious countries, coming here, spending all that time, resources, and all those major investments, to look at this as a project about a single road isn't serious. And you also brought up, the visit of Vice President Vance. Some of us have been working on that, since December, right? He had an advance team that came down. We know those of us who know, right? Vance is the second most powerful person in the world. Why would he come to small, right, relatively speaking, quote unquote, irrelevant Armenia and irrelevant Azerbaijan, two small countries in a small region, right, South Caucasus? Why would the second most powerful person in the world be coming to this region if TRIP and this whole endeavor is simply a single road, right, that's not even regional, that's Azerbaijan specific? These are not realistic conversations. That's kind of what I'm trying to put out
Right.
here.
Look, there's this. I don't want to spend this show debunking narratives that
Yeah.
are trying to. So um, but I don't know. I think perhaps it's because this is such a foreign concept to us at this point that perhaps we don't believe it ourselves, that
It
it's too good
is.
to be true.
Yeah, it
Uh,
is. And listen, I don't
and
blame
I
a lot
don't
of
want us to
Armenians who are
position it.
skeptical.
No, I don't want us to position it like you said, like a silver bullet, because it certainly isn't. It's just
No,
one element of
I
a.
don't. I don't. But I haven't seen anybody, frame it as a silver
Mm.
bullet, right? I haven't seen anybody say all Armenia's issues are solved, right? All of our issues are solved. We have TRIPP. No, but what it has done, right? You have to be honest about this. Azerbaijan stopped shooting. Did the Russians stop him from shooting? No. Right? Did anybody stop him from shooting? No. The European, right, European observation mission did a lot of that, but they still shot, right, when the Europeans were doing their best
Hmm.
and who have been instrumental in this, right? But since TRIPP, even prior to TRIPP, but specifically since TRIPP, right,
Hmm.
Aliyev has been on good behavior. And I'm not saying we have to, we trust
Has he
him.
though? Has he been on good behavior,
We're in the
Nerses?
domain of using force,
Uh,
right?
Sure,
What,
certainly.
yeah, all the stuff he's been doing from 2010, right, until August of 2025. Okay, he completely shifted, right, his kinetic capacity to harm us, to kill our boys, to shoot at our thing, right. It has shifted. Again, I'm not saying that boom, we have peace and everything is solved. We have to be honest about that. It didn't happen in a vacuum. That adds to Armenia's security. Again, so you go from being constantly shot at to having fear of invasion today or tomorrow every morning wake up to at least having some semblance, not absolute obviously, but some semblance of security. How is that a bad thing? We have to be honest about it,
No,
right?
of course, but we also have to be very realistic because Aliyev's posturing, his rhetoric, his statements, it's almost schizophrenic, right? Because we
But
saw him at.
definitely, listen, the guy's a problem. The guy's always going to be a problem. Okay, right? We have to be honest about that
Okay.
because he's become the most powerful actor in the region. While we were sleeping, stealing from our soldiers, engaging in all the juicy corruption that we were doing, right? Okay, and basically made Armenia another deformed version of any, Soviet periphery, Russian periphery in the last 30 years. Okay, this guy was using oil money to create a very powerful war machine. Okay, so now he has that asymmetrical capacity, right, to behave the way he does. Nobody's trusting him. We know what he is.
Mm.
But what I'm saying is, in the mechanisms that Armenia has to control or limit, right, this, individuals, this aggressive actor's behavior, TRIPP becomes an important instrument in controlling or limiting that behavior. That from that lens, right, nobody could say no. So how's that a bad thing, right? That's what I'm saying. We have to look at it through a lens of TRIPP being used, right, among other things, as a very important strategic tool in offering basically solutions to the big puzzle that's supposed to be Armenia's growing security architecture. That's all. But of course, there are no silver bullets.
Okay. Speaking of J.D. Vance, I mean, I have to talk about President Donald Trump, right?
Why not?
Okay. I'm, sometimes words fail me. But how significant was Armenia's participation in initiatives like Trump's new Board of Peace? Because look, for many people, it was kind of, for lack of a better word, cringy, right? Uh, but was it primarily symbolic signaling? Does it represent a deeper strategic realignment? Talk to me about that, please. And
Absolutely. Listen, I'll be very honest. All of this brouhaha is a bit of a nothing burger. And kind of let me frame it so it makes sense to our listeners, right? Most have heard but really do not understand until you go to DC, until you go to the White House, you meet all these people, right, and all these meetings that we're having that I'm engaged in, and I realized it did not cross my mind that the Washington Accords are so extremely important for Trump. You would think, why would it be? He personally considers it to be one of his most important foreign policy successes. Think about that. Okay. So he puts, right, the most powerful country, his administration puts unbelievable amount of emphasis to what he considers to be a success story. That means that puts Armenia, right, small, relatively lack of influence, right? A country that's never been able to have any relevance in the U.S. foreign or security policy structure systems, right? It makes you now important. Okay, so Armenia's relevance to the Trump administration is defined through the administration's lens of we have a diplomatic success story. So Armenia matters because Armenia was a good partner in this success story for the administration. Let's look at it through that lens. Let's make the argument purely America centric, so people understand that there's no naivety here. For example, there are no illusions, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for this administration, Armenia's prime minister, right, for President Trump, Pashinyan is a good buddy. Okay,
Well, so is
like him,
Aliyev
hate
and
him, adore
Netanyahu.
him, whatever you want to do with him, right? For Trump, Pashinyan is one of his good buddies.
Okay.
Personal cell phone numbers and all that stuff, right? Let me tap you on the foot. Let me, wink at you at Davos. This is their relationship, okay? Now, from the domain of a small country, having that interpersonal relationship with the most powerful figure in the world, you have to use that strategically. One, and two, excuse my language, you must be an idiot to antagonize that. Why would you? Okay, right? So once we understand the relevance of TRIPP to this administration and their lens of foreign policy success and victory, now you see, okay, they're giving you a lot of attention, way more than you could have dreamed of. Okay, that's where you're at. So then this Board of Peace issue comes up, okay? What most don't discuss this, right? And, not to get highly technical, the Board of Peace did not happen in a vacuum. The Board of Peace was voted by the UN Security Council.
I know.
Okay, right.
Yes.
So it is an internationally legally binding body, right? That's being formed. Now, what Trump plans on doing with it is a whole different subject of conversation. Okay, so from Armenia's perspective, right, you are being invited to join a UN Security Council sanctioned organization that is spearheaded by the most powerful man in the world, who now offers you all this access that in 30 years you came nowhere close to or could have come close to. So it's in Armenia's strategic interest to reap diplomatic, right, dividends from that invitation and to engage. It's low-hanging fruit because you have zero responsibilities in signing that charter. It's a 3-year commitment. Okay, we don't even know what's going to happen to that thing 3 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it asks nothing of Armenia, but your prime minister gets to sit, right, in a publicity representation next to the most powerful man in the world, who just happens to be, right, doing generally what he wants to do if he's pissed off over a certain foreign policy issue.
Right, but
I
it's
mean,
not about
I'm
the
speaking
optics.
anecdotally, but this is realistic.
I'm sorry, it's not only about the optics. Sitting next to Trump, because it was an alphabetical order. Aliyev was on one side, and Pashinyan was on the other side. It's about, and I also understand. I think we also have to be realistic. Armenia really couldn't say no, right? Like many large European countries who were very obviously absent, right?
Yeah.
But
Which is completely understandable.
and
It makes sense for those countries to be absent. It would make no sense for Armenia to reject President Trump.
I
It
get
would not. It would be against our interests.
right, but you said something that kind of you said the success. I mean, is it a success? I mean, we still
From
don't
their lens, it is.
from
From
there.
their lens, it is. Right? From the administration's
Peace treaty has
perspective, is
not been
that,
signed, and we doubt that Aliyev
yeah,
will
no, I
sign
agree
it.
with you. From our perspective, it's a work in progress, right? From the administration's perspective, you know, these people went from shooting, killing each other to them stopping doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're engaged, trying to engage in trade. We're building an infrastructure. We're talking to both sides, right? The future looks, ripe. Everything's nice and shiny. That's how they see it. Okay, right? That's how they see it. So from their perspective, it's a success story.
Mm-hmm.
From our perspective, it's a very big first step. Okay, but of course, the jury is out. We still don't know how Aliyev is going to behave down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's blind to this, right? And I've been having this conversation with a lot of policymakers in DC. When I make the point that, listen, I'm like everybody. Aliyev's performative diplomacy is designed to win the heart of the Trump administration because that's very important to him. Okay, but is that the same as him having basically long-term visions of peace? So is his behavior commensurate with peace or appeasing or winning the hearts of the administration? One. Two, Aliyev has a lot of economic incentives here.
Yeah.
Okay. So is his embracing of TRIPP and the US normalization process and the Washington Accords, is this an economic centric act or a peace centric act? I think it's an economic centric act because we haven't seen behavior, right, that sufficiently signals peace. If it was, he would have already signed the draft agreement. So it's not like, we're in la la land and we don't know what's going on. We're very realistic about this. But like I said, you went from the position you were in to the position you are now. Okay, you got to use the tools that you have.
No, I get that. And one more thing about Trump, and we can move on. But I think, sorry, a lot of the concerns that I've been hearing, a lot of the chatter, a lot of it justified, I think. And we've talked about this, and you've explained it. But since we're starting a new show, let's do it again. They fear the instability of Trump himself as a politician, as a president, and what guarantees are there? And I know you're going to say there are no
You got to stop using that
guarantees.
word. Well, I mean, you need to stop using that word.
Okay.
We saw what guarantees brought us,
What's
right? The Russian
the
guarantees.
real possibility that when Trump leaves office, TRIPP falls apart or the whole
No,
deal falls apart?
no, that's a ridiculous conversation. Okay,
Well,
so a
it's a
few things.
conversation that's
Yeah,
happening, and you can call it
right,
ridiculous,
but
but it's
again, I agree
happening.
with you.
Yeah.
It's happening because it's happening based on all the nonsense, right? That's being basically proliferated. We have to be honest about that. Okay, and I just want to make 2 points on this. First, you notice that let's say these individuals, whoever these pundits are, or whoever they are, right, that they're concerned about Trump's instability. Well, then, just to go back to your initial point, if you're so concerned about someone's instability, why would you antagonize a powerful and stable person if he invites you to a board of peace charter that requires nothing from you,
Okay.
right? So, in that context, there's a contradiction in this whole argument, generally speaking, that, oh, we need to be very careful with Trump, but then why didn't we decline his offer and piss him off? This is not a serious conversation, right? That's one. Now, as far as TRIPP goes, TRIPP is an institutional process. That's one. Two, iterations of what became TRIPP were around under the Biden administration. We've talked about this. Okay. The concept did not happen in a vacuum, right? Okay. The tenets of the concept were there. When TRIPP was basically the Washington Accords were signed, everybody started talking about that article that Jim O'Brien, the foreign assistant secretary of state, wrote, basically telling us, yes, this will start under the Biden administration. Of course, Biden was a thing. O'Brien was a little, sad because he sucked at what he did. Okay, but fundamentally, these ideas were around under the Biden administration. That means this is an institutional process, and the entire U.S. foreign and security establishment finds it as something relevant and important and commensurate with Armenian US strategic interest and American strategic interest. So this isn't something that the president woke up, had a dream, and said, "This is what I want." Anybody said, "This is crazy, but I guess we have to do it." No. Okay. So the fact that the contours of this was around under the Biden administration and institutionally transitioned into what we have now, and the name just happens to be a TRIPP, is a clear indication that there's continuity in foreign policy thinking and in the development of this project. Also, I've been speaking, it's not just to me, right? In all meetings with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, top ranking Democrats on foreign and security policy, I have not heard single criticism about this project. Not a single Democrat, because we're talking about this as being a partisan issue.
Right.
That if Trump leaves and if the Democrats come to power, what will happen? I have not seen a single partisan actor, right, from the Democratic Party criticize or come up against TRIPP because they see as something that it's also commensurate with America's strategic interest. So why would any, right, next leader of the United States that happens to be a Democrat, okay, abdicate U.S. strategic interest in the South Caucasus, a multi-billion-dollar project that creates stability and peace, and completely, or to a very large extent, okay, marginalizes Russia? See, what most don't realize is TRIPP is important to this administration for obvious reasons. But the Democrats are actually the more anti-Russia
Mhm.
party than the Republicans. And for the Democrats, right, containing Russia's spread from their perspective, okay, is crucial. So let's say Trump leaves and whatever Democrat comes to power, okay, and the party's thinking is that Russia is a regional threat. Why would they remove instruments and U.S. presence and U.S. strategic capacity that curtails Russian expansion to South Caucasus? So, in any iteration we look at it, and I didn't want to get too technical on
Mhm.
this, right? In any iteration you look at it, this argument that when Trump leaves, U.S. is going to be like, so what? All these billions we've spent, and all the international partners we've brought in, and all this nice project that we're able to put together, we're just going to basically dump it and take off. That is not a realistic conversation. That's not a serious conversation.
Okay, speaking of Russia, because every conversation has to include that
That's the South
component.
Caucasus.
How should we understand Russia's current posture toward Armenia? Are we witnessing disengagement? I don't think so, but strategic patience on their part, or something else entirely?
No, it's a question of capacity. Most don't realize how dire Russia's situation is with respect to the Ukrainian front. And so Russia's number one priority, the entire the resources are allocated to that. Okay. So it's not a question of negligence, right? Or patience. It's a question of capacity. And Russia right now simply does not have the capacity to return to the South Caucasus and be a hegemonic actor because the entirety of its capacity is tied down in Ukraine. We have to be very honest about that, right? That's one. Two, whatever capacity and resources Russia is able to allocate to the South Caucasus, they are directly being used against Armenia. So it's not like they're not doing anything, right? We've been talking about Russia's heartbeat capabilities, their operations, stuff that most people don't know because this is not revealed because you can't reveal it, right? Have been persistent. And we are anticipating, right, several waves of very aggressive attacks, hybrid attacks from the Russians prior to the elections. So, minus, right, Russia using force, they are not passive. They still continue destabilization operations. The fact that they're not successful as one would think they would be, that doesn't mean they're not trying. Okay, so in that context, Russia is going to try to do to Armenia, right, what it said it's going to do. They publicly declared that they formed basically a team, right, in the office of the president. Okay, we were the first one to write about this about 7, 8 months ago,
Mhm.
and funds will be allocated to affect and influence and interfere, right, in Armenia's domestic politics. Now, if they're saying something publicly, imagine what they're doing, right, in private. And so, in that context, the Russian conundrum is still there. Now, how does Armenia address this, right? That's going to be the kind of question. What do we do with this partner, right? You have this elephant in the room. They're not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere. I mean, they tried to get rid of you, but you're still around, right? We're a stubborn, persistent people. All right. What's going to happen? Assuming, right, the elections, proceed in a sort of stable, normal manner where you don't have domestic instability and all that stuff. Okay. The next step would be to basically de-antagonize relations with Russia, and by de-antagonize, right, for the Russians to stop antagonizing Armenia. Armenia's entire position is, listen, just because I don't want to be your satellite, just because I don't want to be your colony, just because I don't want to be your slave, doesn't mean I'm against you. Okay, let's be partners. Okay, Armenia has never said that we are severing relations with Russia and etc. etc. What Armenia is saying is we as a sovereign state have the right to choose our own trajectory. And Russia's response is your very act of choice denotes anti Russianness. I mean, how is that a realistic conversation, right? Now, the objective then is twofold, right? After the elections, you need to sit down with the Russians and say, listen, guys, let's come to an understanding, okay? Right? We're here for at least another 5 years, okay? The people have spoken. You're not really popular here for all the things that you have done, okay? Let's develop a working relationship where you don't feel or you don't think that everything I do is against you. Okay, let's have healthy communication. Okay, please stop using the resources of your state to destabilize me. Please stop having all your commentators and pundits, right, who are your mouthpieces, threatening to blow me up, to destroy me, to do all the crazy things that you talk about doing, right? Let's have a healthy and functional relationship because we can never challenge you. We're small, right? We're minor. We're not a threat to you. Okay? We need to have these conversations.
Right,
But
but
Russia is not ready to have that conversation. This
okay,
is the issue.
Nerses, but you went on the assumption that this administration is going to win in the elections because the opposite can happen as well. We
I
could
said,
have,
right, what I'm saying is, right, if that is the trajectory,
if that is the
okay?
trajectory, we might
Yeah,
have,
if that is not
pro-Russian,
what you have,
right?
yeah, if that is not what you have, right, hypothetically, if that is not what you have, and you have a pro-Russian wing taking over, then this conversation is moot. Armenia returns to being the Belarus of the South Caucasus, okay, right? Because then well, look at the parties, right, that are basically presenting the pro-Russia wing, right? They have always been advocates of a union state. And so, if you're going to say something publicly about a union state, you know very well what's going behind the scenes, right? So, in that context, if the will of the Armenian people is to elect, we're being very honest here,
Sure.
right? A new government that's pro Russia, then that's the will of the Armenian people. And that new government then, right, will usher Armenia into a union state with the Russians.
Well,
Because that has been the
uh
conversation amongst them for a long time.
right, but I'm just very curious. I mean, let's assume or let's pretend that or imagine that a pro-Russian party comes to power in Armenia. Do you think it's going to be that easy to get rid of the whole Accords, TRIPP? Do you
Absolutely.
think that they would do that?
Of course, because once you start viewing yourself as a Russian satellite, right, you're an extension. You're just another province of Russia. What you do is basically say no one could attack me because I'm a Russian periphery, right? And Russia would, of course, be delighted to have Armenia back as a colony. Okay, and so the resources, the distribution of resources that you would see from the Kremlin would be immense, specifically in the security domain, right? All they say is, will say is, listen, back to good old corruption, back to good old underdevelopment, you know, elite rule, people suffer, shut up. That's the Russian model, that's the post Soviet model. But Azerbaijan and Turkey won't attack you because now you're my colony. You belong to me,
Mm.
right? In the same way, they can't attack they cannot attack Abkhazia. They cannot attack, for example, Chechnya or Ingushetia, right? They cannot attack either Russian statelets or Russian provinces. They won't be able to attack Armenia. That's it, right? And
But I'm
so,
sorry, they did
the,
attack. I don't understand what you're saying.
no, because back
Okay.
then, you were not considered to be a sufficient Russian
Mm.
slave. Okay, a union state is different, an independent republic is different. Okay, but now if somebody tries to touch Belarus, for example, well, Belarus doesn't have an army. It's a Russian province. Okay, and this is why the whole logic of union state is being used as some kind of a security solution. So yeah, you abdicate sovereignty, you abdicate identity, right? You abdicate growth, democracy, and everything, and you just return to a very, very corrupt, disruptive system. That is basically the Russian model. So what am I getting at? If that is the model that you end up going through, of course, ripping up the Washington Accords becomes very easy. Why not? You just back out of it.
You're making it sound very easy, but as we say in Armenia, we shall see. We will live and
Yeah, we
we
shall.
shall see. Okay.
Again, that's again, but we're dwelling in a domain of the
Yeah,
hypothetical. Okay,
absolutely.
won't even say an extreme hypothetical.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, look, we, as you noted, are heading into what promises to be an intense election period. We're already feeling it. And I'm certain we're going to be talking about this probably every month leading up to the elections. There is a lot of um, apathy, I would say, fatigue among the Armenian electorate. They're just tired of the
Yeah,
politicking,
it's
of the
exhausting.
mudslinging. I mean, myself included, extremely exhausted from all of it. Um, and this is problematic. This is problematic because the vote can go either way. We don't know what will happen in the coming months. We don't know what developments will happen. We don't know what will happen in the region. Look, a few weeks ago, what happened in Iran could completely destabilize the entire region. All of these things, are constantly, it's like a powder keg almost, right?
Right.
What should we be watching to understand where Armenia is headed? Like, what are some red flags or signposts that we should be looking for?
You're talking about in a
with the
domain of
election.
upcoming elections
Yeah,
or regional instability,
take your pick.
or
Let's
both.
we're both. Why not?
So listen, right, just kind of regional instability. There's a general concern that if you have a very, very robust U.S. invasion of Iran or heavy bombardment of Iran, okay, or U.S. Israeli bombardment of Iran that is designed to cripple the regime. And should that lead to a domestic civil war, which are one of the more difficult forms of conflict in conflict studies that we have to resolve, if we go through into that domain, and then you have mass refugee flows into the thing South
Hmm.
Caucasus, then yes, that you would have a destabilizing phenomenon. Okay, but that is an extreme scenario. Minus that, we saw with the 12-day war, the spillover effect, to use sort of the political science discourse on this, the spillover effect is limited. And if there's going to be a spillover effect, right, it would be more of a humanitarian crisis as opposed to Armenia or any other regional actor being sucked into armed conflict. So that domain, right? So we need to qualify instability in a way where yes, you will have it, but would that disrupt the progress that we've had in the South Caucasus with respect to stabilization? So that's kind of what we have. So that's what we need to look at, right? If there are, right, initiations of conflict with Iran, the modality that conflict takes. And that would be what we look at to understand, right, the spillover and destabilization effects, or potentially of it on our region. In the domain of elections, okay, I agree with you. Armenian society is exhausted because this is what Russian hybrid operations do, right? They exhaust nascent democracies that were in its previous sphere of influence by endless politicization, polarization, and constant barrage of misinformation. It's an exhausting process. It's not just us. The Georgians at one point got exhausted, and they are exhausted. Okay, the Moldovans are exhausted. You Ukrainians went through that exhaustion. It's low hanging fruit. This is how Russians operate. So you're supposed to anticipate that. That's one. For the average Armenian citizen, absolutely, it creates what I call, right, democratic fatigue,
Mm.
where at some point you're like, listen, I like the fact that my son is no longer stopped by the police and beaten up for money. I like the fact that I have a business that's competing with, I don't know, this minister's nephew, and I'm not going to be kidnapped by the NSS and threatened and extorted. I like all those things that we no longer have. I like that we don't have systemic corruption. Okay. I like the fact that we don't have sheer abuse of systematized power. Okay. I like that. So I like my quality of life. But man, it's exhausting, right? Consistently being caught in this barrage, in this conflict, and all these sort of, rhetorical back and forths. I agree, okay? But those are the growing pains of a developing democracy, okay? It comes with the territory. We have to suffer it. Now, that does produce apathy, as you noted. Absolutely. Okay. So, with the upcoming elections, we're going to see two things. You're going to see the pro Russia core, which makes up about 19 to 22% of the electorate, the data that we have from the past, is going to vote the way they vote. Okay. And this is very likely going to be distributed with, I don't know, the new Medvedev My Way Party or Strong Armenia, whatever they're creating, right? Or with Kocharyan's alliance, or some with the Republicans, or Sarkis's party. There's going to be some distribution of that, right, with that wing, because for the average, even for the undecided voter, it's very clear what these parties represent. Okay. And then you have the prime minister's core that makes up about a solid 35% of the electorate, right? Consistent results demonstrate a minimum of 35% support base that the prime minister has. And so they're going to be voting accordingly. And then you have, as you noted, the undecided or an apathetic
Which is
voter.
almost half the
The apathetic,
population.
which makes up about, right, roughly between 45 to 55% of the population. That's why EVN right now is conducting the polls for us to be able to gauge those
Yes, thank you
developments.
for that.
But we could talk about that sometime later.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what happens a lot of times is, we use the word apathetic, right? But undecided and apathetic are two different things. An apathetic voter does not vote, right? This is the
Mhm.
problem that you have in the United States and a lot of the West, right? Where you have low voter turnout. That's what apathy pertains to. If you have low voter turnout, the prime minister's party is going to win easily because his 35%, right, becomes 55, 60% because 50% of society is not voting. So their margins increase. Okay. So if we're talking about apathy and low voter turnout, you're going to have the results that you have. If we're misusing the term apathy and saying, while they're apathetic, but in essence, they're undecided voters who will be participating, in which case you can have a high voter turnout. That's where it gets interesting. Okay. But you're going to end up falling into the same conundrum that we had in the 21 elections, where the undecided voter is going to proceed with the logic of the thing, of the lesser evil, right? Lesser of the two evils logic. And now, again, whether that's positive, negative, it is your reality. That is the nature of the beast. So if you're an undecided voter, okay, you do two things. You either have a basically a protest vote where you vote for someone who has no chance of winning, right? Or you write someone's name in whatever it is that you do, okay? Or you engage what is known as, right, pocketbook voting, where you say, while I am disgusted with the rhetoric, while I am completely exhausted with things, I have seen economic improvement. I have seen increase in GDP growth, right? I have seen improvement in opportunities for economic growth. So I'm going to vote for the incumbent. This is known as pocketbook voting. Okay. So you're going to have lesser of the two evils voting, and you're going to have sheer pragmatic voting. Okay. Those who vote, those who are truly apathetic, an apathetic voter doesn't participate. That becomes a self-negating concept, right? So this is what we're going to see going into the 26 elections. Now, can a party pop up that could convince the apathetic voter, right, and do sort of what they call in the U.S. get out the vote drive and convince the apathetic voter, hey, you know what? Re-engage in the political process. The thing is that because Armenia's political parties are not institutionalized, because our political culture is not sophisticated enough, it's going to be really difficult finding a party or an organization capacity to do that, right?
Yeah.
But again, there's 4 months, so let's see how things play out.
I mean, there's a grouping of people who I forget the name. They're saying
They're
vote
opposed to everything. Them in.
opposed to everything. And we were doing our news podcast a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about it, and I was so angry because what does that even mean? We have to understand that
It's right, but it's an interesting
is
youth movement.
so.
It's a protest vote. It's a democratic, well, it's a
I
democratic protest vote.
understand,
What they're
but I mean,
saying
you're
is,
throwing your vote away, basically,
well, do they though? I mean,
don't they?
I'm very indifferent. I'm agnostic on this, to be honest. But is a protest vote throwing your vote away, right? Or you're making a point as a citizen, right? And so if you, for example, okay, if you can't bring yourself to vote for anyone,
No,
okay,
that's not what they're saying. They're saying, "Come vote for us.
right, right,
We're
right,
gonna
exactly. So
we're gonna
that's
fix things, and then we're gonna leave politics."
what they're saying is, if you're not going to vote for anyone,
Right.
that's truly wasting a vote. Why don't you exercise your democratic right
Okay.
and utilize a protest vote where you are against the current political environment, including everyone, right? And so you are against that. And here's our solution. Now, I'm not saying their solution makes much sense. That's a different subject of conversation.
Sure.
Okay. But I'm talking about the principle where a protest vote is not necessarily deemed a wasted vote. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Well, maybe we can end it on that note on my protest about the protest vote. Um, just to wrap up, Nerses, if you were to define Armenia's moment right now, how would you define it? Where are we right now?
It's a country that's in flux with immense potential. That's how we define Armenia, right? And we did something great with the Velvet Revolution, and then they did a lot of bad things to us after the Velvet Revolution, and now our society wants consolidation, and so this is why we're in flux, but with immense potential. And after these elections, Armenia has to consolidate democratic growth, institutional growth, and all those things. Or 2031 is not going to be pretty.
Well, Nerses, this was our inaugural State of Play um, video series. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me.